everyone. This is Matthew Quirk coming to you live from San Diego, talking to Mysterious Galaxy about my new book, Hour of the Assassin. And I'm just delighted to get to talk to Mysterious Galaxy. I've been there for every book, and although this is virtual, we're keeping the tradition going. And the store has a new location and a great story of sort of coming back and is now in a bigger location and is still open and selling books, including this new one, which I'm going to go over and sign. So if you can go on their website and pick it up if you would like to, and they'll have signed copies, and they're all working really hard to keep us authors and readers connected and to keep everybody in good books during the quarantine. And there's certainly a lot of time to read and a lot of need for some escape into these stories. So I thought I would just tell you a little bit about Hour of the Assassin. It's a standalone novel, and it was inspired by some real-life folks I got to know while doing research for some other novels, which is the way a few of these books have come together. I'll meet somebody who's kind of a fascinating character, and then I just can't get them out of my head. And ideally, their job is so cool that I will just sort of mention it to people, and they'll say, "What? That's a real thing? That's fascinating." So for the last book, The Night Agent, it was a friend of mine who sort of worked a night watch and in the most extreme circumstances might have to pick up the phone and wake up the president in a crisis. And for this one, it's these folks who are called red teamers. And in essence, their job is to pretend to be villains. And in my case, the protagonist is a former Secret Service agent named Nick Averroes, and he spent years kind of protecting the most powerful men and women in America from assassination and other villains. And he did it for so long that he was actually able to put himself in the mind of these killers, and that became sort of a gift. And he then went into the private sector. It's cool. He has a little shop in this neighborhood called Shaw in DC, which is all these cool converted garages and warehouses. And he operates there almost as a mock assassin. And when you meet him, he's on his first job doing this. And it's a neat inspiration for a book because, you know, these are real folks. And when I was researching the other novels, I would often run into these problems of, oh man, I need a scene where I need to break into the Department of Defense, or you know, I need to kill a senator. Well, my villain in this fictional world needs to kill a senator. And you know, you can recycle stuff from movies and other books you've seen. You know all the familiar stuff. But I like to do research. I used to be a reporter at the Atlantic, and just love talking to people, and it really kind of fires my imagination for new scenes in the book. So I started trying to figure out, well, who can I talk to actually find out how to do all these wild things you have to research as a novelist. And I found these people, these red teamers, and this is their job. And the first you know, report I found that turned me on to them was them breaking into different secure government buildings and leaving behind explosives in the executive suites. And they used real explosives. And in that case, they used these sort of replica badges that you could get on the internet to sneak past some of the toughest security in the government. So I was just totally fascinated by these people. And in the most extreme circumstances, they, you know, do this sort of work where they're kind of posing as killers. So that was the initial idea for the book. And, you know, I'll often get one scene or image that I can't get out of my head. And it was this notion to start the book of, you have this fellow who's doing this cool mock assassination thing with all the great tradecraft. I turn to thrillers to find out. And, you know, he gets to the moment where, you know, he would be sort of making his kill or showing that he could, and then it turns out his target, someone's already gotten there, and then you're off to the races. And that's all on the flap copy, so, you know, no big spoilers here. I'll leave everything after that to you. So that was the initial inspiration for the novel. And then, you know, some other elements played into it because I also laid in sort of a big political conspiracy of why all this is happening. And that came out of, you know, spending a lot of time in DC, kind of seeing how it works. And really the question is kind of who's pulling the strings of these politicians. And it's a really interesting time now because I think over the last few years, we've seen a lot of instances of people in positions of power, particularly men, who had been able to sort of keep secrets for decades, and then suddenly they kind of crumble. And it was interesting to see the actual tools they used, you know, like non-disclosure agreements and these powerful lawyers who would sort of make a deal, but it would be behind silence. So, you know, that sort of inspired the book, and I took a lot of what I knew from DC, where you had kind of old boys club stuff and politicians keeping each other's secrets, and so that was one element of how I wanted to kind of build out this conspiracy of, you know, what's a secret that could control some of the most powerful people in the world, and, you know, what's worth killing for. And in this case, it's a secret that is kind of so powerful that the people involved in it have been able to leverage each other and use it, and it's built to the point where they're about to take over the most powerful position in the world, the U.S. presidency. And it's fun now, and I was thinking this a little bit when I wrote it, because it's all set in the heat of kind of a cutthroat presidential primary. And also there's some real life stuff, I like to get real issues in there, about dark money and money in politics and how beholden politicians are to their funders and how that world works. So I brought that in as kind of the mystery, in addition to sort of the chase action scene of having my guy on the run from the very beginning. And yeah, it was a lot of fun to write. You know, I tried to show corruption in DC, you know, as it works today, and pull the curtain back on that, but also to, you know, show people who work really hard in DC. And, you know, it's so funny when you read these thrillers, there's just, in DC, like, everyone's so corrupt, and it's easy to get cynical, but it's funny, when you really live in the city, most people there are working incredibly hard, and a lot of people are there not, like, to get rich, but for a cause, but there aren't any headlines about them. So in this book, you know, it is a conspiracy thriller, so you spend a lot of time in these back rooms seeing how all of these decisions get made and how people with money can exercise control over politicians. But, you know, I also tried to shine a bit of a light, especially through my protagonist, on kind of the hard work people do day in and day out to fight that, just to give like a little ray of hope, which is always nice in a book like this. Let's see. So I think I'll go to questions now. I think that's sort of my summary of the book. I'll mention again, I'm really excited. Mysterious Galaxy is going to have signed copies, and I think I'm going to do some sort of like drive-by alley signing thing. That's how things work. During the epidemic, I've done a couple, and it's, you know, makes the normal signing thing feel kind of fun and illicit and a bit like a thriller. So let's look at some questions here. So it says, how did your time as a reporter influence the novels you write? And before I answer, let me say thanks for showing up, everybody. And thanks for the questions. This is from Matthew Berger, maybe Berger. I apologize if I get that wrong. Um, my time as a reporter, the first thing it did was sort of give me the material for these novels. I always loved writing, and then didn't really have. I never knew like what to write about. I loved writing so much, and it was only when I did journalism in college, and then I started working at The Atlantic, and all the politics and foreign affairs and intrigue in DC was just so exciting. It was also in the run up to the Iraq War, and I was like 22 and, had never really been around any of it. So it was just such cool stuff that it gave me the material, and I started writing on the side. And so that helped me uh, do reporting research for these books, which is really fun. So, for this one, I talked to people at the FBI and CIA and Secret Service, and the oh, Matthew Berger, awesome, thank you. Uh, I got the pronunciation from Matthew while we were chatting. Um, and then another aspect that comes from journalism uh, that helps you write is just constant crushing rejection, which is so helpful. Not crushing, but when you come out of liberal arts college and everybody gets like decent grades, and then you go to a place like the Atlantic, they had 10,000 submissions a year, and I was like the 22-year-old kid, and I just wanted to get writing in the magazine and be like a great magazine journalist, and I would just give them stuff, and they would constantly reject it. And I was like, this is impossible, but I just learned to be kind of brutal with myself and my ideas because, I would have 99 and then they would all get thrown out. And then the 100th, the editor would say, oh, that will work. And then I would go do it. And so that's a lesson I brought over to novel writing where, you really need a great concept for a novel, and you also need to kind of revise and rewrite it endlessly. So having kind of professional editors and going through that process for years really prepares you for the getting published side of writing books, where you need to just sort of walk in and get ready to get rejected by, I think I got rejected by like a dozen agents on my first book, and to just keep going. And also a lot of the idea generation, picking ideas, and knowing that nothing is perfect and scenes need to be written 5 and 10 times. So it was a really great training for that. Let's see what other questions we have here. Okay. Here's one. What is my favorite part about writing books? And I don't know. I mean, there's a couple. The first thing is I just started writing, and I imagine people watching this are writers. And the first time I got really into it, it was just like going into a trance and a different world. And it was a summer during college where I would just do it in the evenings, and it was like finding my passion. I just loved it. And it's something that I couldn't stop doing. I was like obsessed with it. Like some people like gamble or, whatever your vice is. When I was working a full-time job, I would just do this thing on the side. And I love doing it. And I didn't even know if I was any good at it. But I just had to. And it's the same way. And I get a little shirty. I get a little cranky if I don't write for a while. So it's just something I love to do. And then my favorite part in the writing process is, and I mentioned this, when I talk with people or give writing advice, is getting away from the computer. Because I find when I'm sitting at the computer, I can like tinker with words, and I feel like I'm getting the job done. But for me, I'll have an outline of a book, and then I will have the next scene that I need to figure out. And basically, you're just thinking about that, getting the rough parameters of what needs to happen, and then I go take a walk and I just let the scene fill in my head and find that to be the best way to um, be creative. And it's a really fun way to work because you're just like daydreaming or strolling around San Diego. Um, and once I have most of it down, then I go back to the computer and write it all down like really quickly. But that's a fun process for me. I like going back and forth between those two. Okay, let's find some more questions. Let's see, here's one. Do you think having a real location and setting for the story made it easier or harder for your world building and having the characters in it? Um, this is kind of a funny thing with DC thrillers. So for the most part, I like to write what I know about, and I have spent a lot of time in DC and got to know people there. So having that real world is amazing for me and helps me build it out. And, I'm thinking about backroom stuff and for Hour of the Assassin and how people cover for each other. And it's wild that like some weird party you went to at some like mansion where you were hanging out with like people who were sort of like muckety mucks or whatever. You can have moments like that are these kind of wild things from your 20s, and then that atmosphere and that sort of stuff that's really drawn from life can inform moments in the novels. And there's also technical stuff, and there's also elements where you know it's like a beat in journalism. If you spend enough time in a place and writing about a place, you just open doors. And it happens really slowly and kind of organically. So I got to know some FBI and CIA people and Secret Service people just through friends of friends. And they'd say, oh, you're writing a book about that? You should talk to this guy. And, or, my friend works at this place. She's like, really senior, and you can chat with her. And so that was all great in terms of just having the material. But one funny thing about real DC, and this is why I like to go there and research and then come back here, um, these thrillers are in kind of a heightened reality. So it's nice to step away from it to tell a story um, where you're not, I mean, you do step away, you try to not let the research tie you down so much that you can't have a great story with life or death stuff and all the satisfying elements of a thriller, which, people aren't or weren't for a long time killing each other in DC. But with, Russia recently, that's been happening. So, yeah, it's nice to know the world really well and then to take moments to say, okay, I'm gonna step away from reality a bit. And it's almost knowing it well and doing the research makes you more comfortable to take some license, because if you get all the details right, um, it's not, you can get away with having some larger than life story and moments. Okay, let's see some more questions here. So, do you find that today's politics, which is so full of intrigue and conspiracy, makes it easier or harder to write political thrillers? And this has been a really crazy thing over the last, 3, 4 years, because when I first started writing thrillers, politics was it was kind of boring compared to what happens in a thriller. And you would have the politics stuff, but then you would have the thriller stuff, and you'd be like, well, this person is going to blackmail people. And there's not that much blackmail, or, you never heard of it. And the idea of somebody getting assassinated, people get killed in thrillers all the time, but it didn't happen in real life, although a lot of conspiracy-minded people think it does. And then it's been wild over the last maybe 4 years or so, to see a lot of the elements of thriller world happening in real life politics. I mean, right now we have this pandemic, which is not just like thriller world. We're in like sci-fi world. It's crazy. Um, and it can, I mean, it makes it a little easier because all of these things are happening. So, for instance, with Hour of the Assassin, you actually saw a lot of stories of the real means by which men in position of power could buy silence or use lawyers or use the law, um, and the way people had that conspiracy of silence and the kind of risks when people tried to break it, and you saw how brave the people were who tried to break it. So it's good in that way when thrillers and the real world are closer together because it feels more relevant and that's very inspiring. But it can be difficult because like sometimes you're writing a thriller and then the real world gets crazier than what you're working on, which happened with my last book, The Night Agent, where it was 2015. And Russia basically assassinated a guy in DuPont Circle. It's not a very well-known story. And, the police, they didn't want to turn it into an international incident. They give it to the FBI and it basically gets buried. So I was thinking about Russia because they were now killing people along like my whole bike route to work. And so I, started working on this crazy Manchurian Candidate story. And then by the time I was done with the draft, um, that was like page one everywhere of what's going on with Trump and Russia. And it was wild because what had seemed like a really outlandish story to me was suddenly like front page news that everyone was speculating about. And I actually had to add a twist to what I thought was a outlandish plot because it was getting too close to the headlines. And it worked out really well. There was like a white knuckle moment where I was like, oh no, my book has been overtaken by events. And then that happens all the time when you're writing. You feel like really the sky is falling, and then suddenly you figure out how to fix it, and you're like, oh, that's even better than what I was working on before. So yeah, it has its ups and downs, but a lot of the research on stuff of crazy murders and things, I just have to read the news murders and cover-ups and blackmail. I just have to read the newspaper now, and I get a lot of my research that way, which I never thought I would see. Well, let's find some more questions here. So we have some questions about what I'm working on next, and it's another standalone. It's in a similar vein. It is inspired by some cool Cold War stuff where some dissidents, I think after the fall of the Soviet Union, um, started talking about the notion that the Soviet Union had sort of um, buried certain elements of a plot against the US around some areas near the capital, but around the country. And I just love this idea of this long buried plot that was like planned in the heat of the Cold War and could be reactivated any minute. And so you have a sort of sleeper agent who starts to rev up that plot and to make that take that Cold War stuff and make it hot again. So that's very early phase, but that's working on what I'm working on next. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I mean, it's funny. Us authors, we just spend all day inside anyway. So um, I'm I'm getting a decent amount of writing done during all of this, even though there's a lot of background anxiety and worries we all have. Let me see. Maybe I'll take another question or two. Let's see. Are there any funny stories from writing this book? Um, Well, there's one funny story from these red team guys because I learned the first couple books I did were sort of caper books, and the main guy was a reformed thief, who went to work in Washington, and it turned out, everyone in Washington was a crook. Um, and so I was doing all this research on how to break into things and out of things, and I met these red team people, and I learned how to pick locks and handcuffs from them, and they one guy was like, "Oh, you're writing, a sort of man on the run thriller of the book that was Cold Barrel Zero." And I said, "Yeah, it's this guy, he's getting chased all over the place." And the sorry, just checking some more questions here. So, I'm reading your books, and you got to take this course. It's an urban escape and evasion course, and basically you go, in my case, to LA, you stay in like the airport travel lodge or something, and you spend 3 days learning how to do all this thriller stuff. But then the big culminating exercise of the course is you get hooded and thrown in the back of a van and then stun gunned to like get you all terrified. Um, for a practical reason, it's like hard to pick handcuffs when you're actually terrified. So they want it to be, as realistic as possible. And then they chase us around to LA, these former Marines, and we had to use everything we'd learned from the course, all of which was really relevant for the novel. So that was a great learning experience. And one of those things, it was just funny where I was like, oh, this stuff is so awesome, man. I can't get enough of it. He's like, well, then you should do this. And then I found myself, running across LA in clothes I had like um, and then the other funny aspect of the handcuff things, which make an appearance in Hour of the Assassin, is if you go to any fancy hotel, we learned this during the course, the concierge will always have a handcuff key because it comes up, when people are enjoying themselves at hotels. So if you ever get in a bind, just find the nearby fancy hotel, and they'll be able to spring you from your cuffs, or if you're fleeing the police, who knows? Let's see. So there's a question about the Mike Ford series, and will it return? Right now, there's no current plans to bring it back, and I love those books. And I thought I had a nice arc with Mike Ford, and sort of got his story and took him through a lot of the things he'd been running from his whole life. So it seemed like a good time to let him and Annie run off into the sunset and get hitched. Let's see, and I think I'll do one more. Let's see. It's a question about. Let me look at these. I have questions on two screens. Apologies. Uh, yeah, it's what is the most challenging part of being a writer? Is it concept, writing, research, editing, or other? Um, I think the hardest part of being a writer is it's basically concept, and more generally, just the head game of it, because I mean, commercial authors, mystery thriller folks, we write a book a year, and it's kind of funny because I was used to being edited and really beating up on the concept for a journalism magazine article, and then writing it, and then getting rewritten. And so when it came to thrillers, I thought I would go to the editor with this like super outline, and it would be like I hear doing a PhD is, they would beat up on the outline and you would fix it, but they just say, okay, we'll see you next year with a book. I mean, people have different processes, and I do get good feedback at the beginning, but really, you're just kind of on your own for a year to write this story, which is a little crazy. And I certainly go through this and I read about other authors who are immensely talented and established, and a lot of us were going through, and one day we think, this is the greatest thing ever written. And the other day we're like, we can't get out of bed because we think it's so terrible and we're screwed. Um, so it's just this kind of wild head game of diving in for a year into this world just inside your head and sticking with that. And it's it's always there. You'll be having dinner or going to sleep, and an idea will come, and I use like a little voice memo thing. It's called otter.ai. It's great. It transcribes it and saves it anyway. So you're always in the story because you are the only thing keeping this world alive for like a year, and then you show it to people, and hope it worked. So it's really a crazy thing like that. And then the other aspect is, I have one deadline and one big project a year, and so it requires a huge amount of kind of self-discipline, and that's where the head game thing comes in, of making sure you meet your goals, because you can't, I mean, it's not like college where you can just like stay up all night to write the book. I think Philip K. Dick used to do that, but I think he used a lot of like Benzedrine or something. So you really need to try to turn it as much into a normal job because it can get so crazy. So for me, that means having a word count, hitting that word count every day, and sort of knowing that will get me to where I need to go. So that's that's some of the vagaries of being a writer. I love it so much, but it's definitely and not the most typical job. Um, let's see. I think let me check in with Mysterious Galaxy here and just see, because I think maybe we should wrap it up. Let me see if there's anything they want me to mention. Okay, and I'll just answer Matthew's question, and then I think we'll close up. And that's do you want to see your books adapted to film? Yes, absolutely. It's really fun, and for us authors, it's well, on the writing side for me, I often, like I mentioned a little earlier, I picture everything happening in a scene, so it tends to be pretty cinematic for me. And then I'm a TV and movie fan and just love them and love disappearing into those worlds, as well as books. So it would just be the coolest thing on earth. And I've had stuff optioned. The 500 had this like tremendous deal, which was crazy because I was just an unemployed journalist at the time, and then Fox picked it up. And it's the most exciting thing in the world, because they're movies and they're like stars and they're people are circling it, and you know major actors are reading it, and you get these emails saying like, oh, this person's reading it, and you're like, what? And then they all have their own companies, and they're like, their executives are gonna make an offer. It's really exciting. And then the trick with being an author is to enjoy that, but then not like lose it and try to go Hollywood or anything like that, because it just the economics of it mean it's a much flakier proposition, because they only make so many movies a year, and each like an inexpensive movie I think is like 30 or 40 million dollars. So to get to yes is like really hard. So the advice I got from people, which was great, is if you get if Hollywood comes knocking or wants to offer on things, that's great. It's nice to sort of get paid twice for the same story, and but just stick with the books, because the other aspect of it is publishing is full of the most wonderful people. And I mean, everyone's in it for the love of books. It's like bookstores too, you know. And you just get to write your story and be in charge of it, and then they publish it. And as I understand it, it's tougher to be a writer in Hollywood because I mean, so many things never make it, and you know, there's fewer outlets, and things go through much more of kind of a committee process. So I was fortunate to talk to some people really early on who said, listen, if you can write these novels, which I love to do, you have the best job in writing. And yeah, I've been so fortunate. So well, that's a good note to go out on. So thank you all for tuning in. Thank you so much, Mysterious Galaxy, and their terrific bookseller Constance for putting this together. And they're all over at the store filling orders. So give them a call. And I think they have shipping deals and are just, you know, being great. And they will have signed copies of Hour of the Assassin, which is upside down, and that's now right side up. Which are kind of hard to get because due to the epidemic, I've only been able to sign locally. So I'm gonna go sign a big stack of them on Friday. So there'll only be so many, and it's a great time to support your bookstore. So by the time everything opens up, you can still go there and get recommendations and see that terrific collection they have. So yeah, check it out. I think there should be links around. And thank you all so much for tuning in and keeping all this great book culture reading stuff going in the middle of all this. And I hope you're reading great stuff. And yeah, good night. Take care, everybody.